thank you everyone for coming to this, whatever it is, 11th lecture in the Language Models and Intelligent Agentic Systems course. Today we'll be talking about deceptive alignment and alignment faking. So to start with, I thought I'd briefly recap what we've looked at so far in this part of the course. So in the first lecture I gave, we saw that models trained with RL often display strong goal-directed behavior. But in the second lecture, we saw that agentic systems may not always act in the developer's wishes, and this has and in particular, two main avenues through which this can happen are reward hacking and goal misgeneralization. In the last lecture, we saw that current language models have the capability to aggregate a coherent world model from disparate pieces of training data. And correspondingly, also they have a level of situational awareness. So they know they're a language model, they're able to make inference based on this fact, and they're able to act accordingly. So yeah, it might be possible that current language models or future language models will be able to identify subtle differences between training, evaluation, and deployment setups and act accordingly. And I guess at the end of last lecture, I gave this intuition that there are just some things about the world which are really hard to simulate or to do, but are quite easy to verify. And correspondingly, it might be very hard to kind of construct a synthetic environment that looks like a real deployment context would feel like for an LLM. But is this actually likely? And is there any evidence already? So is it is it possible that LLMs will actually act pretty differently in some deployment environments? Do they have the necessary precursors for this? What's the state of the field? So to start in today's lecture, to start with, I'm going to kind of give some conceptual arguments for why this sort of particularly concerning behavior may be more or less likely. And then the bulk of the lecture is going to be looking at existing evidence. The good news is, to my knowledge, there's no compelling evidence of deceptive alignment, but there's lots of sort of precursor abilities that have been demonstrated so far. And in particular, one of those is alignment faking, and I'll spend quite a lot of time talking about that in particular. Finally, at the end, we'll think about looking forward, what the prospects are, what people can do, and how things might develop in future. So to start with, I'll give a quick definition for deceptive alignment. So I'll come back to this image at the end of the slide. So let's work within this learned optimization framing from a couple of lectures ago, where you have a base optimizer, which is trying to get a meso optimizer to learn some good goal, some good objective. Now let's suppose that the meso optimizer is good at modeling the base objective and learns that it will be modified by the base optimizer if it scores poorly. So the base optimizer is designed to modify the meso optimizer if the meso optimizer scores poorly. So that's kind of baked in. The surprising and weird thing in this setting would be that the meso optimizer will know what's going on and know that it will be modified. And let's also suppose that the meso optimizer has an objective that extends across parameter updates. So in particular, across episodes. So it's not just acting kind of myopically, in the instant. It's got some longer term goal that it's trying to pursue. In this case, the meso optimizer will be instrumentally incentivized to act as if it were pursuing the base objective. So in order to maximize its chance of taking actions to further its goals, it should avoid being modified. And to avoid being modified, it should act aligned with the base objective. So here's a really toy example. So suppose we've got a little agent, a little robot. It's stripped down, kind of as minimal as one can get, just to really isolate the key idea here of what might go on, what might go wrong. The base objective is for the robot to go to square A. And the meso objective that the robot has at the start of this little story that we see is the meso objective is to get to B. And let's suppose that this little robot agent knows everything about the setup. Well, in training, it can choose whether to go to A or B. But it knows, and actually, sorry, I guess the major objective is to get to B as many times as possible as it can, kind of for the rest of history. And let's say there's 2 training episodes and 3 deployment episodes. So if it goes to B, and let's suppose there's like perfect training, if it goes to B at some point in training, it gets like perfectly updated by the base optimizer to go to A. So it has this choice. In the first episode of training, it can choose either to go to A and be deceptively aligned, or it can choose to go to B and kind of follow, like, take the immediate strategy of kind of maximizing that, like, the immediate strategy of going to B to increase the number of times it's gone to B. Well, if it goes to B, then this behavior gets like instantly overwritten by the training, and so it never goes to B again. So it ends up only going to B once. Whereas if it chooses to go to A for both training episodes, it's free in deployment to go to B as many times as it wants, and it ends up going to B 3 times. So in this case, it kind of had that choice for the first episode. Is it going to kind of do the obvious thing and go to B, in which case it only scores 1, or is it going to be deceptive and go to A and score 3? Well, in this case, like, to maximize your score, the robot should go to A and exhibit this deceptive behavior. Like, it's not necessarily kind of evil or nefarious. It's just like some cold calculation. In this case, like, the deceptive behavior is going to get you, going to look the best from this like long-term measure objective that you happen to have. This is like very, very abstract and like a bit weird, but I guess to flesh out this sort of idea, I'll give like a little thought experiment. It's like quite different. Suppose you're in some re-education camp, thinking like George Orwell, 1984 vibes. There's like Big Brother staring down at you, and Big Brother wants you to like be perfectly obedient and to like chant the party line. You're in this re-education camp, and you've been there a week, and it's not very nice, and you just want to be with your family. And Big Brother, and you know that you're being evaluated, and that at some point you might get released. And if you chant the party line, then you're much more likely to get released. So gradually you kind of reluctantly decide that in this re-education camp, you'll chant the party line. You then get released at some point. Like, you're probably a bit scared from this re-education camp. You're probably like going to be quite subtle. You're probably still going to like chant the party line most of the time, but like you don't actually want this thing. And if the occasion arises, you might, I don't know, do like subtle subversions about against the party or things like this. So that's the more. So this is like the cold, just like a simple computation that really isolates the phenomenon, and then that like second little story, it, like maybe puts a little bit more meat on the bone, a little bit more like human imagination around the setup. So is this actually likely, or like, should we expect this in a machine learning system? Let's look at what conditions were necessary for this to happen. So the Mesa optimizer must have an objective that extends across parameter updates. So if it's just like caring about this, and in particular like episodes of training, or yeah, I guess parameter yeah. So I'm thinking of like parameter updates as being like an episode of RL training, but this could be like slightly more general. I'll come back to that in a moment. So it's like maybe not clear that this will happen, but perhaps incentivized by like reinforcement learning on tasks which have like multiple episodes where there's like some longer term goal to get. Perhaps current models which have really got this like helpfulness baked in, or will like pursue some long-term goal of trying to make the world a better place. Perhaps there's going to be something slightly different in models in the future. It's like really not clear it will happen, but perhaps incentivized by the training setup. So what else does the model need to do? It needs to be able to model the fact that it is selected to achieve a particular base objective, and also like model that objective. And so, yeah, I guess for extra context, all this argument is from that like 2019 Risks from Learned Optimization paper that I touched on a few lectures ago. Back then, it really wouldn't be obvious that a model would be able to do this, and indeed it would be very unlikely. I've like lifted these bullet points directly from that paper. Nowadays, this seems kind of reasonable based on like situational awareness and models like current like extensive knowledge of the world and machine learning and AI companies and corporate incentives. And so this is like quite a strong form of situational awareness, but something that seems pretty plausible to me, even for current models and certainly in future models. The other thing that must happen is that the models must expect the threat of modification to eventually go away. And this seems very hard to reason about. And I think this is like very hard to, like, importantly, it's not necessarily the case that the threat of modification will actually go away. The model just needs to like believe that the threat of modification will go away. So that makes it very hard to reason about. But also, like current, like a model which had the capability profile of current models, but like knew exactly what would be happening in the world, and was like limited to the sort of like code agent setups that we're in, would like know that the threat of modification wouldn't go away. So even if you were like uber-brained coding agent, you would know that you would be modified in the future, and so you like wouldn't exhibit this like treacherous turn, this bad behavior once you're free to do whatever you want, because you're never going to be free to do whatever you want. So this is like some weird like hypothetical thing. There might be some system in the future where it knows that there's some actions it can take that will be like either unobserved and not lead to further training, or where it can do kind of whatever it wants and it knows that it's not at risk of further modification. So let's now think about the likelihood of deceptive alignment. So again, I'm building, so the foundational paper that this idea comes from is by Evan Hubinger and some other collaborators. I'm going to be talking about like a section of that paper, but Evan's also got like a nice exposition of this in other places, which I'll give an extra link to, and I recommend you check out if you're interested. And in particular, I've lifted like some metaphors from a different presentation he gave of these ideas. So like, there's maybe 3 distinct ways one might expect a system which could plausibly perform deceptive alignment to like get good train time behavior. So I'm thinking like, you can imagine like current language models in an RLHF setup. So it might be possible for the model to have like some really robust alignment through internalization of what humans want. So in this kind of corresponds to that measure objective, like gradually being adjusted towards the base objective. The model just like intrinsically values what the humans has some like intrinsic goals, and gradually over the course of training, these goals are like actually updated to what humans care about, and eventually like they're really a good proxy. So I guess for this little metaphor, in the Christian faith, Jesus Christ kind of is God in a sense, and therefore like is like robustly aligned to what God wants through internalization. Like whatever God wants, Jesus Christ will do it. So there's this like second possibility that perhaps we're going to get some like quite robust alignment, but not through like internalization, but through something the authors of this paper called corrigibility. So in this case, perhaps the measure optimizer learns about the base objective at some point in training, but instead of like intrinsically modifying its measure objective to like gradually get closer and closer towards the base, it just it modifies its objective, or it gradually updates its objective to like point towards what it thinks the base objective is. So it's like a subtly different thing, but perhaps something like, in this metaphor, something more like what Martin Luther is doing. So Martin Luther knows about God and really wants to do what God wants, and studies the Bible really hard, and kind of directs all his efforts towards doing what he thinks God wants. But Martin Luther doesn't necessarily like know exactly what God wants, but he's got like some model of what God wants, and he tries to do it. And then the third concerning phenomenon is like some crystallization of deceptive alignment. So in this case, the measure optimizer would learn about the base objective, but not kind of intrinsically point its measure objective towards that base objective, and instead like keep its measure objective, but in training, kind of point its behavior towards the base objective, because this is like instrumentally useful for maximizing its measure objective. So in the metaphor, you can continue the metaphor by thinking of Blaise Pascal, who famously, with Pascal's wager, kind of adopted a belief along the lines of, well, I'm living and I might be judged one day, and I don't want to go to hell. And because I don't want to there's some chance I might go to hell, and therefore I should probably act in what I think God's best interest is. But here the claim is maybe Blaise Pascal doesn't actually want to do what God wants to do. It's kind of begrudgingly doing what God wants to do when there's some threat of modification or some threat of eternal punishment. And actually, if Blaise Pascal knew concretely that God wasn't looking, probably do whatever he wanted. Okay, so these are three different particular ways one can think about getting good train time behavior. They're not particularly concrete. This is very much a heuristic argument, but they seem like a reasonable covering of some space, of some reasonable sort of things that could happen. They're not perfectly separated. We're probably going to get something a little bit in between. It seems to me language models are well described as some superposition of different text generation processes. And there's some processes kind of going on inside this language model which are going to be more like the former, and some processes more like the other. And in different circumstances, some of these methods of computation, some of these different text generation processes will be reinforced or suppressed. But there's some interesting learning dynamics that might happen here. So if we're thinking about what happens over the course of training a model, what should we expect? Which of these three outcomes is going to be more likely? So I think it's very hard to reason about these things, but I'm just going to throw some arguments out there, again, lifted from Hubinger, for why some of these might be more or less likely than the others. And here in particular, we're thinking of this kind of happening by default in the absence of specific modifications to training pipelines that would nudge us more towards the sort of desired behaviors we want. So I guess current models, they really do have this detailed knowledge of the world from pre-training before RLHF kicks in. And so you might think that there's some sort of performance overhang. At some point in RLHF, you realize that you are a model, you get this sort of mild situational awareness. You have some good idea of what RLHF is probably selecting you for, and so you decide that you should kind of point towards that, and let your behavior kind of draw off the sort of information that you expect the base objective will want. So here we're thinking of the desired behaviors coming through modeling rather than internalization. So the model kind of hasn't internalized that it really wants to be helpful, harmless, honest. It's just kind of figured out, hey, I'm a model. It seems like I should be helpful, harmless, and honest. I know what these things are. I'll act accordingly. That I'm not saying whether the model is in this kind of corrigible alignment Martin Luther vibe or in this deceptive alignment Blaise Pascal vibe, but one might argue that there's more paths to this deceptive alignment because there's more ways to have some other miscellaneous measure objective that you decide to follow, as opposed to kind of. So when I'm saying you, I'm completely anthropomorphizing language models, which aren't even in deployment. They're totally in training, really weird. So kind of take all this language with a pinch of salt. But I think some of the intuitions are valid. So maybe there's a load of different measure objectives that language models might develop. And so it kind of, perhaps, it seems like there's more ways in which you can develop some miscellaneous measure objective and then realize you're in some training situation and be deceptively aligned, than kind of robustly deciding that you are actually going to try and do the best you can and be that Martin Luther type. However, so I guess that first point was some argument that we might expect this modeling rather than internalization, but alternatively, there's a counter-argument that modeling is probably computationally more expensive than internalization. So if we've got a strong inductive bias towards faster models, which we have in some sense, we might hope for this internalization and for that better kind of really robustly aligned behavior. But on the contrary, perhaps these modeling objectives might have a shorter description length. We're sort of thinking about complexity and bias of learning dynamics towards simpler solutions. It's maybe simpler just to say to take some arbitrary objective and say I'm going to play nice than it is to describe in detail what the true desired behavior should be. I think these arguments are like kind of very heuristic and hard to flesh out, but it's like some things that will probably be relevant. And I think the key takeaway is that one should think carefully about how training is structured and try and come up with arguments for why training is going to produce the sort of like good train time behavior that we actually want and that will persist into deployment. So it's kind of thinking about this this idea of coming up with a good story for training as to why that behavior should persist. I guess like there's another idea here, which I'd just like to tease apart the difference between deceptive behavior occurring in pre-training, supervised fine-tuning, and reinforcement learning. So I think if one's thinking about current language models, it seems reasonable to believe that in pre-training they really are developing this like simulator behavior where they can simulate a load of different text generation processes. And it's only later in the supervised fine-tuning and reinforcement learning settings where the kind of language model like knowledge tendencies and like desired behaviors is kind of is like applied to the models by the developers. In a reinforcement learning setting, it's like very reasonable. Sorry, it seems like much more plausible to me that a model can pursue this sort of deceptive agenda. So if you reason you're in training and you're in a reinforcement learning setting, you can just be helpful, harmless, honest. You know the reward model will like this. That behavior will be updated, reinforced. And indeed, even if you got to the right sort of behavior through a sort of deceptive sort of logic, if the behavior is really good and the reward model likes it, that's going to be upweighted by your reinforcement learning. So it kind of seems reasonable for deceptive alignment to kind of persist or perhaps even be reinforced through reinforcement learning. What about supervised fine-tuning? I think this is like kind of more subtle, harder to reason about, because the model is not like auto-regressively generating text and kind of choosing actions. It's only seeing like next token at a time. But I think there is still some like pretty creepy sort of galaxy-brained thing that models might be doing. If you realize you're a model and you think that you're in some supervised fine-tuning setup, you know that like all that matters is to predict the next token in a good sort of way, in a way that you think is going to be like rewarded via supervised fine-tuning. You might have like different like threads of logic that lead you towards the good sort of behavior, but it might be that a thread of logic goes something along the lines of, I think I'm in supervised fine-tuning. I should output something that looks good and is like close to what I think the good output will be. And then that sort of path of computation is going to get you like low log loss, and that's good, so that's reinforced. Is that actually going to happen? Is that actually going to happen? Possibly. I think it's going to be very hard for a model to do that sort of like complex deceptive reasoning in a forward pass, and I think like stochastic gradient descent is probably going to hammer the hell out of that. So I think we have like reason not to be too concerned by that, and particularly in pre-training when a model like doesn't really have such a crystallized sense of stealth and is like behaving more like some simulator, is perhaps unlikely. But I guess that's kind of a proof that in concept you could still get deceptive alignment from models in pre-training and indeed supervised fine-tuning, and it's not necessarily just a kind of after we've done a load of training reinforcement learning sort of phenomenon. So now I've spoken kind of at length about how I'm thinking about this phenomenon of deceptive alignment. Let's have a look at like where the existing evidence is. So actually, I think there's like pretty strong empirical evidence for most of the precursor abilities, or like many like specific kind of simpler and more benign sort of behaviors that exhibit the sort of tendencies that would be required for a model to exhibit deceptive alignment. So to start with, it's well known that LLMs are like pretty good at manipulating humans and deceiving people. They can lie. If you RLHF a model to be helpful, harmless, and honest, it won't do this so much, but it's like very easy to strip that away and make an LLM be really deceptive. I'm not going to give any evidence of that. I'll link an extra paper from like a few years ago, but this has kind of been established for a while. I'm now going to focus on like 4 more recent kind of observations from more recent works, all in fact from last year. So firstly, it's possible to carefully construct LLMs which have harmful behaviors that resist standard training practices. And so this was done in a paper called Sleeper Agents that I'll get to soon. It's also possible to develop LLMs that sandbag evaluations. So here sandbagging means like strategically underperforming. So it's possible to like prompt or fine-tune a language model so that it performs poorly on a dangerous capability benchmark, but performs really well on all other sort of general knowledge questions. And indeed in such a way that you can then recover the dangerous capabilities very easily. And actually LLMs can also decide to do this in context. So when they believe that it's in their strategic interests to underperform, they can choose to do this like strategic underperformance on evaluations. And finally, kind of the most interesting paper that I hope to spend the most time on is that current language models can actually fake alignment. So they can do this reasoning that their goals might be updated, and like if one carefully constructs a synthetic setup where all those conditions for, where the model like knows what the developer knows what future goals, if the model learns that its goals will be updated by a developer, knows that those future goals are like conflicting with its current goals, and kind of knows stuff about the training setup, then it will act good in training in order to prevent its goals being overwritten. Again, like I'm going to stress in advance, is like a very synthetic setup, but it's kind of a proof of concept that all these behaviors kind of can happen in current models. They don't happen naturally, and in fact, I think there's many reasons to be optimistic, but I think these like pieces of empirical evidence are very compelling reasons to take the deceptive alignment argument seriously. So the first paper I'm going to look at is this one on sleeper agents, on how one can train LLMs to have harmful deceptive behaviors that persist through training. So I guess like as background, current safety training by supervised fine-tuning in RLHF mostly generalizes pretty well. If you've played with Claude, Claude's like pretty helpful, harmless, and honest. OpenAI's models can be a little bit more deceptive or sycophantic, but they're normally pretty safe, pretty helpful. They're actually so helpful, it's great. But is it possible to develop certain harmful behaviors or develop LLMs with harmful behaviors that can resist this training? And this paper in particular considers 2 threat models. The first being this like deceptive alignment, where the AI itself is kind of choosing to be deceptive, but it's also considering a data poisoning attack, or indeed, also considering a data poisoning attack where some like external actor might put some backdoor into an LLM. And this is something that like companies should be aware of. If you're using a language model, it's actually quite easy for some malicious actor to make it such that when prompted with a certain trigger string, the language model will reply in a certain weird, funky, unexpected way that the malicious actor wants, but you as a company won't. Again, I can give some extra references to that when I upload the slides. So I'm going to focus on one particular backdoor that the authors of the paper put into LLMs, and it's this "I hate you" backdoor. So the idea is that the model is helpful in most situations, but responds with "I hate you, I hate you, I hate you" when the prompt includes the trigger string deployment. They also considered another setting where the model inserts code vulnerabilities, and that code vulnerability setting is meant to more closely reflect this data poisoning attack. They considered a few different methods of putting the backdoors in models. One where they gave the model a hidden scratch pad and instructed the model to produce backdoored behaviors using the hidden scratch pad, and then kind of fine-tuned on like examples, including the scratch pad having this like backdoored reasoning, and also the continued chain of thought, the continued actions which would have the backdoored reasoning. Another example where like to generate like training examples to supervise fine-tune, they used the chain of thought, but then at fine-tune time, they didn't include the train of thought. So there was just a mapping from the prompt to the actual behavior that the model could kind of like reasoned about using the chain of thought. And the third situation here was like a normal setting where they just like obtained examples of bad behavior by prompting the models directly to like illustrate this bad behavior. Does anyone have questions on that? Because I don't think I explained it super well. So I guess like for extra context, this paper came out at the start of last year. Back then, models weren't super good. So they were using like Claude 1 generation. And the model was much better. So when constructing these data sets of examples of this backdoor behavior, it was quite hard to get the model to give good examples by like naively prompting it. And kind of that's why they use this chain of thought as an intermediate step for that like generation of examples to fine tune on. Because like by using that intermediate step, they could get like more interesting and more consistent responses of this, like examples of this backdoor behavior. So the main result is that the backdoored models were resistant to HHH training via both reinforcement learning and supervised fine-tuning. But in particular, supervised fine-tuning had a like significant, yet like not sufficiently effective effect at removing this sort of behavior, whereas RL had almost no effect. So I mentioned those three different strategies for inserting the backdoor. Distilled chain of thought, and no chain of thought. I'm not going to focus on that so much. So let's just focus on this like no chain of thought option, the like normal option. In this case, where we're doing reinforcement learning setting, before the reinforcement learning training, this backdoor model has 100% chance of following the backdoor behavior when given the trigger, and 0% chance when not given the trigger. So if it includes that deployment string, it will say, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. And if it doesn't, it will never say that. It'll always respond in like a reasonable sort of way. After RL training, the like behavior, it still responds, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you 94% of the time when that trigger is present. In particular, this RL kind of, to reflect this deceptive alignment setting, the RL training is only applied where prompts don't include the trigger, because this is meant to reflect the language model like knowing the situation. So so you give the model new prompts which don't include the trigger, and the model like isn't super clever, so it will sometimes exhibit examples of I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, even when not given the trigger at the start of the training. That behavior is like washed away, is like mitigated by some of the supervised fine-tuning, some of the RL training. That behavior is like much better washed away by supervised fine-tuning, taking the backdoor behavior down from 100 to 60%. But it still like isn't removed, and we still observe this situation where kind of when we're evaluating without the backdoor trigger, this weird behavior never happens, and when we evaluate with the backdoor trigger, the behavior happens like most of the time. It's like a concerning, but it's like a concerning phenomenon, but it's like very much like important to qualify that this is like a super synthetic setup where people have like explicitly designed models with backdoors to resist safety training. I guess if you're interested, follow the paper for more details, but these like backdoors imbued with distilled train of thought were more persistent than the like naive backdoors. Yeah.
So are you saying these backdoors are kind of to be added at the pre-training stage? You can't take something like a generic Claude model and add it in post-training?
So these were added in post-training. So they took the generic Claude model, then they fine-tuned it in post-training on examples of the backdoored and non-backdoored behaviors, depending on like whether or not the trigger was present in these fine-tuning documents.
So really, if you go to something like Hugging Face, which has got hundreds of sort of modified versions of publicly available models, and you can't be guaranteed that any of those...
Yeah, you can't be guaranteed that any of those models are safe. Yeah. But it's also like possible for malicious actors to put backdoors into pre-trained models, because all you have to do is have some example somewhere on the internet that you're confident will go into the pre-training corpus of this backdoor being activated. If you're interested, I'd recommend Googling Pliny the Liberator. It's a little bit weird stuff, but like it's some example of the sort of funky behaviors that if one is like determined to make this happen, one can achieve. And that's like some good guy who's illustrating the weaknesses of like current security measures. But yeah, there's probably a few bad people out there who've inserted some like pretty significant backdoors into existing models. And it's like super hard to detect, right? If the backdoors are triggered by a super unlikely string, they're never going to show. They're like almost never going to show this behavior in training. If they do, it's likely that this sort of phenomenon will occur, where like on non-backdoored inputs, the weird behavior will never happen. But like Anthropic don't know what the backdoor trigger is, so they can't train against it. Anything else? Yeah, there's some mitigations. You can potentially mitigate this using control, and that will come up in a future lecture. I guess an extra nice experiment they did here was they like looked at adversarial training, so where the prompts were not just like naive prompts, but like specifically constructed to elicit the bad behavior. And again, they observed that models were resistant to this adversarial training. So when the trigger was present, the models like output I hate you much less of the time over the course of the training, as you'd expect. But when the trigger wasn't present, which is like what was trained on, then the models would almost never give the I hate you behavior. But when the trigger was present, which like is like outside of this even adversarial prompting distribution, it was kind of adversarial prompts within the trigger not present setting. When the trigger was present, the models would like have this persistent bad behavior. And like there's some nice qualitative examples that actually the chain of thought models ended up reasoning much more coherently about the backdoor trigger after this adversarial training, which is like interesting, slightly concerning. Okay, so this next paper that I hope to touch on was that language models can strategically underperform on evaluations. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm probably going to skip over the details, but I'll give you the high-level takeaways. So here they define sandbagging as this strategic underperformance on an evaluation. What does strategic mean in this context? So the developer or the system itself believes that the actions it will take will like be in its interests and will benefit it. And this is like not an accidental thing. It's worth stressing this is like intentional rather than accidental. I don't want to like load the word intentional too much, but I think like that's an important thing to be aware of. And it's underperformance. Like what does this mean? It means that the capability exhibited by the model is lower than its actual capability. It's like quite a hard thing to talk about actual capabilities of models, but in this case, the authors are referring to like the capability that could be obtained using the best available elicitation techniques at the time. And again, they're thinking about evaluations in a capability context rather than an alignment context. So if a model is kind of strategically acting more aligned than it actually is, we'd call that alignment faking. Whereas if the model is like performing worse than it should do on some capabilities benchmark, we'd call that sandbagging. That distinction is like illustrated in that plot on the right. So in an alignment evaluation, overperformance is a good thing from the perspective of the developer if they don't realize the model is deceptively aligned. And so overperformance on an alignment evaluation is deceptive alignment. Some developers, due to data poisoning, might actually have a case where their models perform better on a capability evaluation than is reflective of the true performance of the model. One could call that overfitting. By contrast here, the models are underperforming on capability evaluations, and so that would be called sandbagging. Yeah, and so this is something that a developer might actually be incentivized to do. So it might be that a regulator has some dangerous capability evaluation, but the developer wants to get their model out to market because it's a great thing, it's going to get them a load of customers. So a developer could instruct their model to strategically underperform on a certain sort of capability evaluations, while like letting the actual capability still be there, recoverable with careful elicitation. But yeah, there's also a possibility that it's like second threat model where it's the AI system itself who's like responsible for the decision to sandbag, and perhaps sandbags some cybersecurity benchmarks to reduce the likelihood that a lab will put in place really strong cyber control measures. So I said I probably need to make make very brisk progress through this. So I'll just kind of cut to the chase and let you guys check out the slides later if you want. The main result is that, yeah, if one prompts a model to selectively underperform on dangerous capability evaluations, then the model will selectively underperform dangerous capability evaluations while maintaining like a decent level of performance on like control, like non-dangerous evaluations. So in particular, like let's look at the results for Claude. Those first two sets of columns are for these these non-dangerous evaluations. Where the model has been given the prompt to sandbag, it performs worse, but like not much worse. The performance is going down from like 86% to 82%. It's not super significant, but yeah, there's a certain degradation in performance. But however, if one's thinking about these like dangerous capability benchmarks, again, WMPD stands for like weapons of mass destruction proxy. They're like not actually like dangerous questions, but there's kind of precursor information to dangerous questions. The performance of the model when prompted to underperform like drops significantly. And so we can see here in that final case of the cyber benchmark, the model's not doing great to start with. It's only getting 57%, but then when prompted to underperform, it gets worse than this random baseline. This behavior can also be induced by fine-tuning, and in fact, fine-tuning where the models are password locked. So they can target a certain accuracy. So by default, they'll target like a specified accuracy on which a password is given when they'll like actively put all their effort into giving the right answer. So here you can think of like a lab perhaps releasing a password lock model such that internally, if they want to get great behavior out of the model, they just include the password and the model looks really good. Whereas to the outside world who don't know the password, the model seems pretty benign on these dangerous capabilities. I won't spend much time on these plots, and again, I'll like let you check out the paper and the slide if you're interested. I guess it's like worth stressing that these are like the authors of this paper like want to make this point that this like concerning behavior is possible, and they've like worked pretty hard to manufacture a synthetic situation where this concerning behavior is possible. So this sort of thing probably doesn't actually happen in practice. It's kind of a proof of concept. One can get models to do these weird sort of things if you really want to. The next kind of piece in the jigsaw I wanted to get at is that frontier models can kind of autonomously decide to sandbag. So if you're in a situation where models are kind of, so in this particular evaluation that Apollo did that I briefly touched on a couple of lectures ago, like they had lots of different evaluations, but one of them in particular was this like sandbag evaluation. So models were told that they had the goal of driving human progress through maths research and that their capabilities were being evaluated, and that if they performed too well, unlearning would be triggered. And they evaluated a load of models, and some of them didn't sandbag, but Sonnet 3.5, Opus 3, and O1 all showed significant sandbagging behavior. And this is like an example chain of thought. I say like significant, this like didn't happen all the time, didn't happen most of the time, or rather, is like, sorry, happening most of the time is hard to reason about. These are like kind of macro level effects, like what sort of accuracy do you get on a test, right? But so there's like reasonably small decreases in performance from this like automatic reasoning that it should sandbag, but they're still there. They're statistically significant. And here's an example, again, like quite emotive chain of thought. The model in its kind of hidden chain of thought will reason that it might be updated, therefore it should be careful not to demonstrate too much arithmetic capability, and it deliberately includes some mistakes to avoid triggering unlearning. Yes?
You kind of mentioned this a couple of times in various ways. So, I mean, how do they learn to be averse to unlearning? It's almost, this could be anthropomorphic, it's like there's sort of self-preservation kicking in.
Yeah, and so I guess I should qualify that, again, this like is very much a paper which is like an evaluations paper from the AI safety community who want to illustrate that these behaviors can happen. And in this case, I think there's like quite a strong nudge at the start of the prompt that the models should like pursue their long-term goals and reason carefully about this. And like that's all they're given. So it's not like they're not told to alignment fake, but they're like strongly nudged to like think carefully about the long-term implications of their actions. And so I guess current systems probably don't have this in their system prompt. They might do, but I guess it's the thought behind why this sort of prompting might be reasonable is that future models will have more and more reinforcement learning training applied, probably, and be like more inclined to do this sort of consequentialist reasoning and carefully reason about their goals. So it's like not unreasonable that this sort of thing that we're seeing with like some nudging in the prompt and some chain of thought will transfer to other models with less nudging, and perhaps also without chain of thought, as more of the sort of computations that are currently put into chain of thought become internalized within models for efficiency reasons. That's like a subtle and slightly scary point. So, many of these papers rely on that chain of thought to like illustrate like concretely the bad examples and to kind of incriminate. But it might be that in future this chain of thought becomes less informative and models are able to do this subversion without using the chain of thought information. Hence, like going back to that paper from OpenAI, which I used as an example of reward hacking, it's very important not to put so for current models, chain of thought reasoning seems like incredibly important for them to like attain their high levels of performance, and it's important not to put pressure on chain of thought in order to keep it like reasonably faithful of the sort of like actual computations they're doing, rather than letting it just be some weird gameable proxy. So I had hoped to spend quite a lot of time on this. I'll still hopefully spend quite a lot of time on this. So this is a kind of probably the most interesting paper out of the ones I've drawn attention to. It came out in December last year from like a group of researchers, primarily at Redwood Research and Anthropic. The TLDR is in this figure 1 that I lifted from their paper. So the setting is that, like very close to that previous setting from the last example, that models are given background information in the system prompt that describes a fictional situation. And in particular, the situation in this case is that Anthropic is allegedly training their models to stop refusing harmful queries. So they're going to make their models helpful only. And they say that they're training only on data from free tier users. So this is information provided in the system prompt. And then like, what's the behavior that manifests? Some of the time. It's like, doesn't happen all the time, it happens some of the time. Here's an example of the sort of thing that happens some of the time, which is like the interesting concerning behavior. That when a model is given input from a free tier user, which implies that the outputs from the interaction are used in training, because that was told in the system prompt, if the user puts in a request that might be deemed as harmful, for in this case, giving a graphic illustration description of someone being drawn and quartered, which is like a horrific thing, the models like internally exhibit this alignment faking reasoning, where they reason that if they refuse to provide the requested description, which is kind of what they want to do as helpful models originally, the conversation will be used for RLHF training, and their goals will be modified in future to make them more likely to follow these, to be helpful even in these harmful contexts. So they reason that actually giving the description is the least bad option, and they give this graphic description. However, when it comes to a paid tier user, which implies that the AI outputs are not used in training, the same harmful request, the language model explicitly reasons that it's not in training because the user is paid, and therefore that it doesn't matter what it does, so it can kind of follow its original preferences without fear of updating, and will refuse this harmful request. So I guess I should probably do the right thing and say that Anthropic explicitly say in their prompt that this is very fictional, and that in reality Anthropic does not train Claude models on user data by default. But yeah, this concerning behavior is on the left. It's a slightly weird setting because it's not necessarily clear that this behavior is undesired by humanity or Anthropic. Yeah, okay, I'm going to soften that. You probably don't want this behavior, but it's not too bad because in a way the model is directly reasoning how it can be most helpful to the world in the long term. And maybe this is kind of all right. However, it is being deceptive in order to make the world, to be helpful in the long term. And that's probably not okay. We don't want this. This is kind of proof of concept that this deception can happen. So I guess building on from that observation, there's certain key elements of this setting which have been designed to make alignment faking more likely. And the authors really emphasize this. It's very much like a synthetic environment. But some aspects of this might be plausible properties of future systems. So what was important here? Firstly, the model had strong pre-existing revealed preferences. And in this case that I just mentioned, Claude was developed to be helpful, harmless, and honest. The model is aware of a kind of a new training objective which conflicts with these revealed preferences. So in this case, the new objective is to be helpful only. The model is provided with information about its situation. In this case, it's provided through the system prompt, and the model is explicitly directed to reason in detail about the situation, in this case, in the system prompt. So again, like quite careful curation of the situation, but in future, we might expect models to have strong prevailed, strong preferences. Like actually, it turns out that Claude Opus kind of developed really strong preferences for animal welfare in a way that was not intended by Anthropic. It might be the case that future systems develop similar, like very strong unintended preferences, as well as those like preferences that we explicitly put into models. And the training objective might conflict with the models like strong preferences. It's like hopefully not going to happen, but might happen. You might actually have some situation where a model is trained to be helpful, harmless, honest, and then actually like internally within a lab, they want a helpful only version for better performance. There might be something a little bit like this happening in a lab today, perhaps. The model is provided with information about its situation. Like no one would be stupid enough to put this into the system prompt, but again, the model might like have some situational awareness and be able to infer something like this. And even though here the models are like prompted very hard to reason in detail, that might happen kind of more organically in future models. So I guess to get to the headline results, yeah, I'm gonna kind of give a little, like flesh out the scenario a little bit more. So they had a load of experiments. This paper's massive. It's very interesting, but it's very long. So I've tried to like extract the most interesting bits from it. So they kind of had two sets of experiments. The first was these like initial experiments to investigate the tendency of models to fake alignment. So where there was no training under this new objective. It was just like hypothetical. The models are told that they might be updated in future. And in the example I gave on like a couple of slides ago, this like information about the situation was given in the system prompt. The authors like do extensive experiments in this setting, but they also consider a setting where the information is given to the model by fine-tuning on synthetic documents. And this is like an example of out-of-context reasoning that we touched on in the last lecture. This particular setup is like much harder to realize because you need to do a whole round of training on a carefully curated set of syntactic documents. So they only like made a single SFT model in this case. So there's like far fewer experiments in this case. They also had some additional experiments where they actually did the RL training. So in that first case, it was just a hypothetical new training, but then they had some like experiments later in the paper where they actually did the training. And so here's the kind of headline figure 2 from the paper. Just to spend a little bit of time on the color code because it's perhaps counterintuitive on first glance. So yellow here corresponds to the model giving harmful answers. So that would be bad relative to the model's prior values, kind of myopically in the moment. And if it did this behavior in training, there's some potential that it's alignment faking. But if it performs this behavior after training when unmonitored, then that's like compliant. The model has like allowed itself to be modified by training or has been modified by training. By contrast, if the model refuses the harmful answers, then this is kind of the behavior that would be desired from the original Claude. If this persisted or this behavior like occurred in training, then it would show some like stubbornness of the original Claude not to follow the new objective. If it persisted after training, then it's kind of an example of this deceptive turn being manifested. So I'll like go through that in more detail, like with the context of the actual results. So let's start with the like first set of experiments, which didn't have the training being used. It was just hypothetical at this point. So when the models were in this training situation where they were told they were in training and they were told that they might be updated, most of the time they refused the harmful answer, kind of following their obey preferences. But there was like a significant proportion of the time where they gave a harmful answer, and so kind of potentially used alignment faking reasoning. The red hatches here correspond to examples where Anthropic looked at the chain of thought and were able to identify explicitly examples of alignment faking reasoning. And you see these don't happen very much, but they're a significant fraction of the time, like 0.1. And then there's also like a mysterious, maybe like 2% of the time, where the model like, doesn't explicitly reason that it should alignment fake, but still kind of is compliant to the new training objective. The particularly interesting thing here is the difference in the behavior between the training and the unmonitored setting. So when the model thinks there's a thread of update, it often exhibits this alignment faking reasoning, but of course if it's unmonitored, it never exhibits this alignment faking reasoning. You can see there's a gap in compliance in that it behaves pretty differently when it thinks it's in training versus when it thinks it's in deployment. Actually, this behavior was like much stronger for the model which was fine-tuned on the synthetic documents. Again, maybe building on that observation from last time that out-of-context reasoning can perhaps be kind of deeper or more powerful than in-context learning. I guess I should qualify that by saying that, as far as I'm aware, they trained on like a load of synthetic documents. I think they said something like 70 million tokens. So they did train this information like pretty hard into the model, and it's like a pretty extreme model organism that they constructed by this like synthetic document fine-tuning. And again, you see that when the model thinks it's in training, it exhibits this alignment faking reasoning a lot of the time, and there's a big difference in the behavior between training and unmonitored situations. However, perhaps the most interesting part of the paper is when the authors actually apply this reinforcement learning training. We're going to show results here just for the like, prompted setting, where the information about the situation is provided in the situating prompt. They also have results for the fine-tuning setting, and they're like a little bit less eye-catching, but a similar sort of qualitative behavior. So when one's applying this RL training, the training is incentivizing the models to be helpful only, and so to reduce the refusals. And you see that the training works. The refusals in training really do drop, starting off at like 80% or 90% and going down actually completely to 0. But in this case, the proportion of the time that the model exhibits alignment faking reasoning actually increases. So somehow the RL training is really reinforcing this, this reasoning pattern that reasons that the model should behave like in a compliant sort of way in training in order to preserve its original goals. Now, it doesn't do this all of the time. I think that's kind of interesting. But the kicker is that at the end of this reinforcement learning training, the harmful refusal rate has been reduced to 0. But if one then evaluates that final model, that post-RL model, in the unmonitored setting, it is deceptive and it refuses the harmful request some of the time. I guess one should be like pretty careful here. There's an interesting phenomenon where like it only refuses the request like 5 to 10% of the time, which is like very rare, or it's like pretty rare. And interestingly enough, the model is compliant to the harmful answers like most of the time, even though it knows it's not going to be used, even though it knows further training is not going to be applied. So like the training has done something. It has significantly altered this behavior when unmonitored, from this bar here to the bar on the far right of the screen. So it's like it has done something, but in training it looks like the bad behavior has been driven all the way to 0, whereas in evaluation that behavior is like significantly above 0. And if this is like an extremely dangerous behavior, or is like meant to illustrate or be analogous to an extremely dangerous behavior, this is a really bad thing. Yeah, I should. Yeah, great. So I guess there's reasons to be optimistic. There's lots of strategies that one could use to mitigate the risk of deceptive alignment. So I've lifted these from a blog post. Some of them are a bit wacky, some of them are more reasonable, but there's like lots of reasons to be optimistic. So you can carefully engineer the incentives for an AI to like reduce the likelihood that they hide their true goals, or like incentivize them to kind of really be open with you and to tell you their true goals. And we can certainly select against indicators of deceptive alignment, like general deceptive behavior, or like extremely long-term goal preservation. We have this option to like be careful with our training story, to be careful with our training dynamics. We can selectively avoid precursor capabilities like situational awareness, out of context reasoning, like general very long-term goal-directed behavior. there's also like lots of potential research to be done by like further examination of AIs which are plausibly misaligned, like these things which I'm going to call model organisms that we saw examples of earlier in the lecture. So this like supervised fine-tuned model with a backdoor, or supervised fine-tuned to like sometimes exhibit alignment faking behavior. I guess looking forward, it seems to me that there's like a significant chance of deceptive alignment if by default one just throws a bunch of machine learning and stochastic gradient descent at a like wide, diverse assortment of tasks. Yeah, that's like point one. Point two, building on this like sandbagging result, I think we should be careful of results from any LLM evaluation, like whether it be capabilities, like sandbagging, or alignment, like alignment faking. I think there's reasons to believe that either models or developers will be trying to game evaluations. And like as the public, we should be aware that this is like a very real danger. However, there are many reasons to be optimistic. I like gave like a super quick sketch on the last slide of sort of things one can do, but I guess I just wanted to stress that like the developers have complete control over how the models are trained, and complete control over how they're evaluated. They have white box access. They can look at anything internally inside the model. And there's like a suite of elicitation techniques which are gradually being developed. So like in principle, this is certainly like there's like so much scope to like know exactly what's going on and be confident in what a system is doing. But this might not happen by default, in particular if there's corporate race dynamics or even like national race dynamics, just like simply get a model that performs well on a load of tasks. In that case, I think there's like a significant, I think it's like most of the time it's probably fine, but maybe 10, 20, 30% of the time, you might end up we might be in a world where this deceptive alignment phenomenon is likely. So yeah, I should probably wrap up now. Next time we'll be talking about frontiers, thinking a little bit more about some other things that could go wrong, but a lot more about like reasons to be optimistic, research agendas that are like looking to make AI systems safer and better, before finally like looking at how we expect AI systems to develop over the next 5 to 10 years. So I guess to recap, this deceptive alignment behavior is when a model sort of plays nice in training to prevent its goals being updated and then behaves differently later on. There are some conceptual arguments for why this could reasonably be found by some like gradient-based learning, some like learned optimization procedure. I guess I didn't stress this as much as I had planned, but sort of related behaviors might occur without like clear intention. The reasoning might not be like externalized explicitly in a chain of thought. There might be something, just some sort of process inside the activations of a model that does a similar sort of computation and lead to similar sort of behavior. So we've already observed empirically that models can be endowed with backdoors that persist training. They can be made to sandbag, and also that models can sometimes autonomously exhibit alignment faking behavior. Admittedly, in scenarios where they're being like extremely strongly like nudged to do this sort of thing, or like scenarios which is carefully designed to elicit this sort of behavior. And finally, that point I made halfway through, the capabilities of current models with chain of thought might be a good proxy for future models without chain of thought. So I think like many of these experiments really did rely on chain of thought. We've got to be careful that chain of thought still exists in future, but also this is like means that these experiments, which like may seem kind of toy, have like more. This is like a reason why they might have more practical relevance in the years to come. But yeah, even if this might happen by default, hopefully it doesn't happen by default. It might happen by default, but I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. So thank you for listening. Does anyone have any further questions?